Now let's move on to something else. Again, try and reason this out on your own, but then obviously I'll give you the answer. We're talking about whether a member of Congress is more likely to vote like a delegate, right? That is, they're going to vote in a way that reflects the majority view of their constituents, the majority opinion of their constituents, or whether they're more likely to vote like a trustee. That's where they use their own best judgment to determine how to vote. The more important an issue is to their constituents, are they going to be more likely to vote like a delegate or a trustee? Well, hopefully you said a delegate, right? Because if an issue is really important to their constituents and they vote in a way that is not in line with a majority opinion of their constituents, they're going to be way more likely to remember that, right? If it's an issue that's not particularly important, then they may not remember that. But if it's important to the constituents will remember this, remember it. So if you're in a district, for example, that is very, very concerned about climate change, and there's a bill that's designed to address climate change in some significant way, and you vote no on it, your constituents are going to remember that. Right? If you're in a district where farming is particularly important and there's a bill being debated, I'm sorry, I had to sneeze. um, if there's a bill being debated that's not good for farmers, and you vote in favor of it, if it's one that helps out manufacturers or somebody else, not farmers, they're going to remember that. So the more important an issue is to a member of Congress, the more important an issue is to a member of Congress's constituents, the more likely that member is going to vote like a delegate. Well, here's another one. Are members of Congress going to be more likely to vote like trustees or constituents or delegates? The more complex that issue is to constituents. If an issue is really complex, are um, members of Congress going to be more likely to vote like a delegate or a trustee? Well, hopefully in this case you said a trustee, because that would be exactly right. When an issue is really complex, right, oftentimes the media doesn't cover it very much because the media doesn't like covering issues that are complex because they're hard to explain. And so people aren't usually informed about those kind of issues. If you recall, I talked about this when I talked about interest groups. Do you remember you watched that video where this gentleman was explaining credit default swaps? It took him 2 minutes and 45 seconds to explain credit default swaps, which is as long as most news programs go for one report. And even then, it was really still pretty hard to understand. Well, the news media doesn't cover that stuff. And because if they don't cover it, the constituents aren't going to be informed. And if constituents aren't going to be informed, then a member of Congress has a lot of latitude to vote in a way that he or she thinks is best, right? And then oftentimes negotiations over these kind of complex issues, they happen sort of behind closed doors. Remember, I'm tying this back in now to interest groups. Remember when I said the inside game works best when issues are complicated, narrow, and technical. That's when lobbyists will go and speak directly to a member of Congress or their staff or policymakers to talk about these complex issues. And so the media doesn't cover this. This is why members of Congress have a lot more latitude when it comes to complex issues. So the more complex an issue is, the more likely that a member of Congress is going to vote like a trustee. And again, the more complex an issue is to constituents, the more likely the member is going to vote like a trustee. Now, I want to make one last point, and this is really important, because the way that I've been framing this is sort of members of Congress have an option of voting like a delegate or a trustee, and they're like on opposite sides of the spectrum. But the truth is that members of Congress frequently vote like a delegate and a trustee at the same time. And here's why. Let's go back to that congressional district that is very concerned about climate change. Well, when candidates are running for office, they're most likely going to elect somebody who is concerned about climate change. They're going to vote for somebody who has their same values, their same interests. And so when that bill comes up for that member of Congress who represents a district that is concerned about climate change, they're going to vote like a delegate because that's what the majority opinion of their constituents is. But they're also going to be using their own best judgment because that's what their values are, and their values match their constituents. So I don't want you to think that the option is either voting like a delegate, voting like a trustee, right? Sometimes members of Congress do both at the same time. And I don't want you to think that when a member of Congress votes like a trustee, that means they're basically ignoring the majority opinion of their constituents. Oftentimes those two things are connected, more often than not. Okay, so it's important to keep that in mind when you're making this distinction between delegates and trustees. Now on the essay, if you answer that question, but then at the end you point out and explain this part, you're golden, man, because that's great, because that'll let me know this student really understands this concept. Now in the next set of videos, we're going to talk about the two other primary functions of Congress. Okay?